Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in the Blavatskyhouse. We will continue with our lectures here on the Sunday afternoon, each month. And the title of the lecture of today is The Secret of Happiness. These lectures will be broadcast on the internet, and they have a wide range. They are listened to in many parts of the world. This afternoon lecture will certainly attract the interest of many people, I think, because after all, who doesn't want to be happy? The first part of my talk will take for about half an hour, and you may interrupt me if you want to ask your questions. And then there is a short break. You can get something to drink or take a look in our library or the bookshelf in the back of the room. You can find our books and our magazine, Lucifer, the Light Bringer. And the second part of the lecture will take for about half an hour as well. And again, you can ask your questions during or after the lecture. We appreciate your questions very much because it gives us the opportunity to explain better the Theosophical ideas. You may all know that we don't have paid employees. We are all volunteers, but you can support us financially. You can give a donation for our work, but much more than your financial support, we appreciate your being here, your presence, and your willingness to listen to the Theosophical ideas. Well, I hope you don't expect a panacea from us, a kind of spell or a kind of meditation technique that can make you happy, because no one can make you happy. Young lovers often say, if I've got you, I'm perfectly happy, but there are many people who get a divorce, so if they were happy, it was a short-lived happiness. There are as many ideas about happiness as there are people. However, when we talk about happiness this afternoon, we actually mean something different than the common idea about happiness. We are talking about an elevated state of consciousness, and what is generally understood by happiness is something we would prefer to call enjoyment or pleasure. Well, happiness, being a state of consciousness, is within you. So there is nothing outward, nothing outside of you that can make you happy. That is the sadness of the society, the suffering of mankind, that we think that there is something outside of us which makes us happy. Why do so many people play in lotteries? Why do so many people think that when the outer circumstances change, when, for instance, they have another job or a new house, or when they have made that dream vacation, then they will be happy? Well, these are questions that we have to ask ourselves firstly before we can solve the secret of happiness. You know, we don't really know what happiness is, and although everybody wants to be happy, of course, you may wonder if you will ever be it if you don't know what it is. And I get the impression that what people nowadays in general understand by happiness is what better could be indicated by the word pleasure or fun or joy or something. Do you also often hear, for instance, Friday afternoon, the weekend begins, enjoy your weekend, enjoy. We place a picture on Facebook, on a terrace with a glass of wine, enjoy. Enjoyment seems to be the ultimate form of life. Now, something very strange is happening in relation with enjoyment. You can only enjoy something if you suffer at the same time. You can only feel enjoyment if you have pain or sorrow, or you are unhappy, or whatever you want to call it, at the same moment. So you feel pain and pleasure simultaneously. Plato, the Greek philosopher, the great Greek philosopher, he explains this paradoxical statement in one of his dialogues in the Gorgias. In his well-known question and answer dialogue, where Socrates always asks the questions, he reasons as follows. He says, all need and all desire, all want is painful, is something that hurts. If you are thirsty or hungry, you suffer. Thirst is a torment. Quenching your thirst or quieting your hunger or satisfying any other need or desire is pleasant, it's nice. If you are thirsty, it's nice to drink. You then enjoy your cold drink. And why are you enjoying your drink? Because the torment, the thirst, disappears. If you don't have a lot of thirst, and the torment is therefore not that big, you enjoy less of that cold glass of water than when you are very thirsty. That's all very logical, isn't it? But we don't realize that that pain, that torment, and that enjoyment occur simultaneously. Enjoying a cold glass of water goes together with the torment of thirst. And when the thirst is gone, drinking a glass of water is no longer a pleasure at all. If you have a full stomach, you have just dined extensively, then eating food is even a torment, even when it is a delicious meal. It's all very logical, I think, and that's why Plato concludes, for each of us, the moment on which the thirst or any other need and desire ends coincides with that on which you stop enjoying drinking. In other words, you can only enjoy if you are suffering at the same time. And every time you suffer, you long for happiness. And if you desire, you suffer. It's a vicious circle. So when your colleagues say to you on Friday afternoon, enjoy your weekend, they actually wish you to suffer too. And if you extrapolate this simple truth to our country or to society or to the entire world community, and you see the tremendous suffering in the world, the conclusion is obvious that the suffering is caused by desire, by the fact that there are so many needy people. People are thirsty, and of course not just physical thirst, but thirst for power, thirst for wealth, prosperity, respect, health. Also, healthy people are very thirsty for health because they are afraid that in the future they may not be healthy, and so on and so on. You should ask yourself how much of our energy, of our vitality, our power of action and our thinking is aimed in quenching all those different thirsts, satisfying those different desires. And then you will discover how much misery and sorrow the satisfaction of those desires bring about. If there were no desire, there was no war. I can assure you that. In short, the secret of happiness is not the satisfaction of desire. The fact is that the more you desire and the more your desire is satisfied, the greater you suffer. It's like drinking seawater. The more you drink, the greater the thirst and therefore the greater the suffering. By the way, desire is not bad. We will try to make clear that later on. In fact, without desire, we will never get to know the real lasting happiness. That happiness, however, is different from what is generally understood by happiness and what we just call pleasure or enjoyment. It should therefore not be astonishing that Plato in the Gorgias also makes a distinction between enjoying and what you can translate as spiritual happiness or bliss. And we are not talking about word games, but we try to give you a hint to grasp the ideas. Both words, enjoyment and bliss, express a state of consciousness. Enjoyment has everything to do with the state of consciousness that comes from desire, from want, while bliss is a completely different situation, a state of consciousness which is much less known to us, and that we can describe as a condition in which you realize that there is unity in life, a state that mystics sometimes experience, and that in Sanskrit is called Atman. What is generally understood by happiness is a certain condition that exists only because of the opposite. Winning a football match is for the fans of that club enormous joy, while for the fans of the other club it is immense grief. This kind of happiness is a relative state which therefore only exists within a pair of opposites. If there were no defeat in football, there was neither victory. In fact, you might wonder if fans could ever be happy with a victory if they didn't know that there was also the possibility of defeat. Happiness and misery are therefore related to each other. They actually exist only thanks to each other. It's the same with the concepts of good and evil, or any pair of opposition, which can only exist because of the opposites. If there were no evil, there wasn't good. An absolute good and an absolute evil, the idea of God and the devil, is certainly not something Theosophy teaches. No, there is no absolute good and evil, nor is there absolute spirit and matter. All those things are relative. If you make of happiness and unhappiness, if you make of those two words absolute terms, just like good and evil, then you get delusional images of a perpetual heaven and a perpetual hell. I've always wondered how a perpetual heaven with an all-encompassing bliss can exist if you know that at the same time there is eternal pain and suffering in hell. Imagine you are in a supreme state of bliss. Well, you know that there are other people, maybe your family or your friends or neighbors, burn in hell. Then your happiness would be immediately eliminated, wouldn't it? Well, we do not talk about this external happiness or pleasure in a talk, pleasure that exists because of suffering. What we are talking about is precisely a state of consciousness that rises above the pair of opposites, above pain and pleasure. You know, in different religions, you find the advice, the virtue, to raise above the pair of opposites. In Buddhism, one of the paramitas, one of the noble virtues is viraga. And viraga means indifference to pleasure and pain. And why do we have to be indifferent to pleasure and pain? Because then the illusion is overcome and we come into a state of truth. Understanding illusion and reality is one of the most important keys to achieving lasting happiness. And that's why we have to have a clear picture of what illusion and what reality is. Often it is presented as if illusion is something that doesn't exist. It isn't there. There are philosophical schools who assume this. They are called absolute idealists. For example, they say that this outer world doesn't exist at all. From the standpoint of Theosophy, we do not think that this is really the case. This is not a tenable position, because how it is possible that we still gain experience, that we can grow in consciousness if this outer world doesn't exist. In our course, Thinking Differently, we also assume that the outer world is an illusion, but we do not assume absolute idealism, but objective idealism. I will try to explain to you what that is. We consider the concept of illusion as in the East the term Maya is used. Maya is translated as illusion, that's a correct translation, but literally it means what can be measured. Ma, the Sanskrit root, means to measure. So literally it means what can be measured. So everything that has a form is an illusion. Not in the sense that it doesn't exist, it does exist, but in the sense that it has a form and therefore is temporary. It is not sustainable. It has a beginning and therefore also an end. Vanity of vanities. You can read it in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. Everything is vanity, everything is an illusion. It has a beginning and thus an end. So the joy of a victory, the joy of the first wedding day, it passes. But the opposite is also true. The sadness of a lost match, the suffering of a defeat is an illusion as well. So the whole life of man on earth is one great Maya. After all, we are born, we live some time, and then we die. It's vanity, everything perish. Now we could leave it at that, but that would be a very sad end of the story. You could say everything is illusion. We don't have to talk anymore about it. But that's not what we want to say, because just because the fact that everything is an illusion should be a reason for us to investigate, to wonder why it is that everything is an illusion. We have to think about it. The concept of Maya as we see it can actually only be understood if you involve the idea of objective idealism. And by this, we mean that something is true for someone if he assigns truth to it. So for the toddler, Santa Claus is a fact because he gives the dressed up man with that long white beard the status of truth, the status of a good saint who gives presents to children. For the nationalist, his country is the best because he identifies perfectly with it. What actually happens is that we assign a certain truth to something which, if you look at it from another point of view, from a higher point of view, doesn't have that value at all. We identify ourselves with something and believe that's true and give it a certain value while it's actually something else. In Thinking Differently, we illustrate this with a well-known story from the Vedas of the snake and the piece of rope. At twilight, a man returns home and he is startled by a snake. But if he takes a closer look, he sees that it is not a snake, but a coiled up rope. His fear, however, was as real to him as if it would have been a real snake. In the same way, millions and millions of people are inclined to grant reality to the phenomenal world. For example, look at the value that people assign to money. It's only paper, and sometimes it's not even that. It's just a few numbers in a computer. And yet, the happiness of an entire nation depends on it, and so many human beings are willing to do a lot, if not everything, for it. People believe that this outer world is real, while it's an illusion, because it comes and it goes. It's not something that exists in itself. It does exist, but just like a shadow exists, or this sheet exists, because something else works in it or through it. Well, what does it really mean that everything is an illusion? If you reflect on this issue, if you really think deeply about it, then illusion actually means that there is something behind that form, behind that maya, behind the temporary phenomenon that comes and goes. There must be something else. And this we call the spiritualistic starting point, this spiritualistic view. We will try to explain that. And we try to explain it by comparing it with something else. When you make a walk in the forest in autumn, especially when it has rained the night before, then you see a lot of mushrooms, all kinds of mushrooms. Those mushrooms are illusions. Of course they do exist, but they are only the outer product, so to speak, of a whole network of fungal threads the biologists call hyphae. Mushrooms are only a very small part of that hyphae. The largest part is below the ground and is invisible for us. What we want to say is that there is something behind that mushroom, something that is actually the same, but what you can call the source of that mushroom. And what is behind that mushroom is actually much more lasting. That mushroom only exists a few days. That network behind it, all those fungal threads, those hyphae, live much longer, much more durable, is much more lasting. Now, in an identical way, there is behind the human manifestation, so behind you and me, but also behind an animal, or a plant, or a mineral, or a cell, or even an atom, or if you look at the universe behind a planet or a star, there is a network, a force, a power. We usually call that power consciousness. That force or that power is not essentially different from that manifestation, no more than that mushroom is essentially different from the fungal network behind it. But that outer appearance is a maya, an illusion. It comes, lives, and dies. It lives some days in the case of a mushroom, and 70, 80, 90, 100, maybe 105 years in the case of a human being, and then it disappears, retreats into that network that is behind it and that we used to call consciousness. And we can extend this comparison between humans and mushrooms even further. I don't hope that you will tell later on that, according to Theosophists, human beings are mushrooms, because it's just a comparison. But if you look at the different mushrooms, we often don't realize that they are the different fruits of the same network of fungi, that there is an underlying unity. Now imagine that one of those mushrooms, and you have to use your imagination, wants to be happy. Would it be successful if it does not take into account those other mushrooms who are actually a part of it, which belong to the same network? Well, if there is consciousness behind the human being, so if the outer person is nothing else than the phenomenon of that consciousness, and if that person wants to be happy, would that be possible if he positions himself as an isolated being? In other words, he doesn't realize that he is the fruit, so to speak, an illusory fruit of an immense network of consciousness, which millions of other people also belong to, where in fact all phenomena belong to. It's that unity in which the secret of happiness is located. Individual happiness, personal happiness, never lasts long because it's an illusion and has a beginning and thus an end. Aiming for this happiness, this pleasure, as Plato calls it, is the same as building a house on ice. It will become spring, the ice will melt, and your happiness disappears into the water. We will therefore have to search for that unity, or rather, we will have to become aware of that unity. We have to work for it. You do not get happiness, you have to go for it. You have to work for it. You must try to realize that we are that unity. Well, of course, I don't know what's the case with you, but I must admit that I not always experience that unity. So there is apparently something within me that doesn't realize that unity, that doesn't realize that universal force behind the phenomenon that I am. That universal force is present in all forms of life, is in essence those expressions of life. And this simply means that I don't know myself. You must first cognize yourself, your own consciousness. Well, there are many ways to cognize yourself. You have to understand yourself, and we don't mean by that that you have to get to know all your characteristics, a kind of self-reflection about the beautiful and less beautiful qualities you have, whether you like sports or art, or whether you eat a lot of just a little, or whether you are diligent or lazy. Well, those are interesting facts that can help you to get any insight in yourself, but it is not the understanding of yourself what we mean when we speak about happiness and unity. Above the temple of Apollo in Delphi, it was written, "Knoti Sirten," know thyself. And we believe that it doesn't mean that we should know the phenomenon that we are, the mushroom, no. But we should know the consciousness network behind the outer man, behind the personality. So you have in fact two kinds of self-knowledge. Knowledge about the illusory self, we usually call that self the personality, or the lower self. And knowledge about a much more permanent self we can call the higher self. Now, in the religious and philosophical literature of antiquity, in all civilization, they assumed the complexity of human consciousness. Some systems divided the man in three aspects, like the Bible, spirit, soul, and body. Others divided consciousness in 4 or 7 or 5 aspects. But let us start this afternoon very easily with the dichotomy, consciousness divided in 2 aspects. That is something that everybody can experience immediately. There is something in your consciousness that is focused on itself. It places itself in the foreground. It says, I am better, more important than others, or I am sadder, or I suffer more than others. That part of your consciousness thinks that things like this tends to selfishness, considers itself as an isolated being. But I think everybody, and you certainly all, has ever experienced something different, something that allowed you to rise above yourself. That part in you doesn't say I, it says we. This part lives in the sense of solidarity and sees itself as a part of a larger whole. Small children already experience the dichotomy in themselves. If you say to a toddler or a preschooler that there is a naughty and a sweet little John or a naughty and a sweet little Mary, then they know perfectly well what you mean. We use slightly different words. We don't speak about naughty and sweet, but about the higher and the lower self, but that's just a matter of words. So, the higher self lives in the awareness of connectedness, while the lower self lives in the sense of isolation, the feeling of separateness. Now, we can further refine these terms, and then we are approaching the terminology we use in our course Thinking Differently, although in Thinking Differently we don't use any Sanskrit words. You can say that human consciousness is has 7 layers. You can divide it in 7 parts. Atman, the divine part, the self, capitals. Buddhi, the spiritual part. Manas, the mind, the thinking aspect. Kama, desire. Prana, vitality. Linga Sharira, the model body, also called the astral body. Sthula Sharira, the body of flesh and bones. Now you may say that the higher self is composed of Atman, Buddhi and Manas, and the lower self is composed of Manas, Kama, Prana, Linga Sharira and Sthula Sharira. And if you have listened carefully, then you have heard me say that Manas, the mind, belongs to both the higher self and the lower self. What's up with that? Well, we can explain that well by displaying these 7 principles in a square and a triangle. You see the same 7 principles. Atman and Buddhi belong to the triangle, the spiritual part of our being. And you see that Manas is divided in a higher Manas and a lower Manas. And that means a mind, a thinking capacity that is focused on the spirit side of nature, and a mind that is focused on the square, on the outer side. Our soul has, in other words, 2 tendencies. One upward, so to speak, to the spirit and to the divine, and there is a tendency in our soul that's focused on earthly things. And if we zoom in more on Manas, we can explain this better. In nature, the small repeats and reflects the great. So just like the entire human consciousness, Manas, the thinking aspect, is composed of 7 principles. So there is an atmic part of Manas and a Buddhic part of Manas. And you see the translation of those terms we use in our course Thinking Differently. So the atmic of Manas we call the inspiration, sense of oneness. Buddhi, insight, idealism, intuition. Manas of Manas, the intellect, desire, vitality, emotion, feelings, that is the Linga Sharira of Manas, and the physical. And we claim that everybody can recognize these thinking aspects in themselves. And if you recognize them, it will be easier to become aware of the permanent and the transitory part in yourself. So you will know that there is a part that is never satisfied and never can be happy, at least never can experience a lasting happiness. And there is a part in you that can experience bliss. More about that after the break, but let me first give a summary of what I've said. Well, enjoyment, a state of consciousness that arises from desire, and bliss, a state of consciousness that originates from Atman, a sense of unity. That's the difference between the lower self, the personality, and the higher self. We talked about objective idealism. Something is real for us when we concede reality to it. The spiritualistic starting point behind every phenomenon is consciousness, which is composed. The phenomena are Maya, are illusions. All consciousness comes from the same source, so there is oneness. And two kinds of self-knowledge, knowledge about your personal characteristics and about your spiritual background. Any questions?
You gave this broader meaning or explanation of happiness, and I was wondering, can you do this for suffering? Is all the suffering? Let's say I suffer, or I suffer because the we is suffering. I was thinking, you understand me?
Yeah, I do understand. Well, there is a kind of suffering that has anything to do with your personality, yeah, because you think that the circumstances in which you live are not very good, or you don't have any friends, of you, yeah, all those kind of personal sufferings. That's in fact all illusion. But you can also suffer because of the suffering of humanity, and that's something different. That's something different. Then you suffer not because of your own pain, but because you see a lot of suffering in the world. But even then, you have to try to raise above those sufferings, those feelings of pity, because, and you have to be very, a little bit cold about that, because you don't help others if you suffer with them. And if you suffer, you don't have the means to get a clear view of how to help other people. And the real bliss, I'm going to tell you in the second part also, the real happiness is in fact not aiming for your own bliss or your own state of unity, but in fact the real bliss is helping others, showing others the way to their happiness. And in that endeavor to help others, you may suffer because they don't listen, and because in spite of your words, they do things which you know will lead to suffering for them, etc., etc. For instance, a mother or father who is trying to give a good education to her son or the daughter, but sees that her son or the daughter is going to is walking down a road which will lead undoubtedly to suffering, and you can't do anything. That causes suffering for those parents as well. So we see in the world a lot of suffering, and we try to help those people, but we are not always able to do that, and that is, of course, a source of pain for us. Is that more or less your question? There is a great Dutch poet, a woman of the beginning of the 20th century, who wrote the suffering of the world. Because of the suffering of the world, I cannot sleep at night. Yeah, poetry is something that is lost in translation, but in Dutch it's beautiful. And we know the case of Helena Blavatsky in London. She was a young girl, and she came home, and she was very sad because she saw so many people which had no idealism at all, just living for the day and the material world. So they didn't see a claw of light, of idealism, of spiritual force in them, and that was a reason for her to cry. So, of course, Zarathustra, he spoke to the people according to the books with sadness, because he saw that they were doing things that would lead undoubtedly to suffering. Yeah? So we can suffer because of others. And that's very different than the personal suffering. Any other questions?
The suffering from the higher level, is that the starting point for action?
Sometimes it is.
Is it?
Yes,
Is it
yes.
good?
Sometimes it is, yeah. When you are confronted with the suffering in the world, then the compassion in your life may arise. Yes, I think so. Yeah, that's in fact, now it's a very difficult subject, but if you see the 4 eras of the Hindus, the Satya Yuga, and the Golden Era, and the Kali Yuga, the era in which we live now, the Black Age, is often a time in which you may progress spiritually more quickly than in a more quiet time, in a paradise or something, because you see the suffering, you see everything happening, the speed of everything, and that may be a reason for you to try to evaluate more quickly than when everything is fine and everything is nice and there is nothing and there are no struggles and there are no challenges at all. Yeah. Yeah. So there is a saying, and I think that's true: suffering is your best friend, because it helps you to develop your spiritual qualities.
On both levels.
Yes, even if you are in your personal level, you are suffering, it may be a reason for you to change your way of thinking, therefore change your habits, and change your character, and change your destiny. So it may help you. It's not a reason to change, but it may be a reason to change your thinking patterns. Yeah. Yes?
Can you say something about that when people are trying to help the other ones not who suffer, they you see a lot of people who gets in sort of burnout phase.
Yes.
So that
well, I think when you help, and maybe I'm going to hurt somebody, but I think if you help in a super personal way, you never get a burnout. If you try to help in a personal way, that means that you are personally involved, and then you feel sad because the other doesn't want to do the things you do, or you feel happy when you have any success. When you help in a personal way, that is in fact may be a reason for you, when you've got a lot of failures, to get a burnout. But if you help in an impersonal way, and you are not personally involved in it, then the case is very different, I think. And then you will continue to work, and you don't mind if you get a good or bad result, because you do it for the action itself and not for the reward. And that's very different. And of course, we are not Buddhas yet, and sometimes we are a little bit disappointed, and that may give us a sad day. But if you are impersonal, you will sleep, and the other day you go on with your work. Yeah, keep on going on. Yeah, well, I think that's the reason. Yes.
Is this what you're stating right now? Living in your higher self, not personal self. You're not going for personal results. You're in your helping. others, you're simply giving what you are, the best you are, to others, without
Expecting anything.
expecting anything. So this is actually, you're forgetting yourself, the lower self. You are what you are expressing.
Yes. Well, that was the answer I tried to give. Yeah. You say something different, or?
No,
Okay. Then we
no, it's just you're not going for the results
No.
of your action. But in the same, when you are helping others from the view that you see suffering around you, how is it that you cannot be touched by the suffering that still is around you? So there's a contradiction in it. You're doing what you're giving what you are, but it's not enough. And in the help to others, do you keep on helping others in the same way all the time, or
I don't get the point. What's your questions?
the question is, how far can you rise above the suffering when you still see it around you and you are giving everything you...
Well, that's a difficult question, and of course we are all personalities as well. Yet, we are not Buddhas, and so of course, if I'm working in, let's say, in a country like one of the countries in Africa where it's a famine and a lot of children are starving, yeah, I will get impressed because I'm not so impersonal that I can stay cool, yeah. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't try to help. And what I want to say is, the more personal you are, the more you get involved in results, the sooner you will get a burnout or something. And if you are impersonal, and impersonality always goes with wisdom, and you see the causes of the suffering, etc., then your way of helping will be different as well. Because if you are an impersonal guy and you have some wisdom, then you will try to solve the problems in another way because you go to the cause of the problem. And the cause of the problem is always the mentality, the way people think. And the way you help others is very different than when you, for instance, are a good guy, but you don't assume the spiritualistic starting point, and you try to help by giving people food, or by changing laws, or by changing the society. And then I think it's far more easier to get burnout than when you are wise and you know that only the causes of the suffering, if you change those causes, there will be a lasting solution for the problems of mankind. Yeah, and of course you need a lot of patience for that. And you know that there are many lives to come, and there are many possibilities to go on and to help, etc. Then I think that wisdom in combination with compassion is the real solution for the world. Yeah? A cup of tea? All right. Well, part 2. I will start with a dangerous quote. So my wife is in the room, so I don't hope she will get angry with me. There is a Persian proverb that says, "Do you want to be happy for one day? you should marry. Do you want to be happy for a year? You should read a good book. And do you want to be happy for all your life? Become a gardener. How should we explain this? Well, we usually, not always, but a lot of people marry out of desire. So I think that marry in this proverb is the symbol of desire. And if you think that you can satisfy your desire, you will be disappointed because your desire never satisfies, but only call for new desires. So that's not the way to be happy. Then the other one, reading a book. I think that's the symbol for the intellect. It gives you some more lasting happiness because you rise above the merely personal desires, but an intellectual man or woman is not yet able to see the larger connections, the inseparable connections between all beings. He analyzes, cut things apart rather than he sees the connectedness. Nevertheless, the intellect is a super-personal aspect because a real intellectual never lives and works for his personal self. The ego is not important, so he uses his intellect because of, for instance, scientific curiosity. So he's happy for 1 year. But if you really want to be happy, lasting happiness, you have to become a gardener. And that means you must work with nature. Only by working with nature you will get happiness. Now you may wonder, what's nature? Is it the surrounding nature, the plants and the animals? Well, they certainly belong to it, but it's not the nature we are talking about. The word nature comes from a Latin word, natura, and that comes from nasci, and that means to be born. Nature is not just the outer world, the plants and the animals. No, she is much more. And then we're speaking about nature with a capital N. It's the force field, the consciousness, the underlying unity from which that outer world is born. So, to say it in the terms of the mushroom and the underlying fungal, the hyphae, nature is not just a fruit, not just a phenomenon, but equally and especially the consciousness network that works behind it or works through it. You may call it the energy side or the force field or vibration or consciousness. Use the word you like. It's that nature that Spinoza, the great Dutch philosopher, called God, but not the creative God, the pantheistic God, and that is the all-pervading divine power. Become a gardener, live in the unity of nature, and you will be happy for all your life. Know that you are a part of nature, work together with nature, with the laws of nature, and you will never be thwarted by nature. Separate yourself from nature, and then you will reap the consequences that will take away your happiness. After all, there is a law of karma, a law of cause and effect. Of course, you all know the word karma. It's one of those Sanskrit words that crept into the dictionary of almost all modern languages. Literally, it means action, and philosophically, it means that every action produces a consequence that is strictly in accordance with the correct characteristic of that action. So violent action evokes violence. A selfish act means that you will be confronted sooner or later with the selfishness of others. You will have to experience what the characteristic of your action was. So if you go against nature, demands more than you actually deserve, live at the expense of others, then you have to experience what it is that others live at your expense when nature reacts on your selfish acts. Often karma is only understood in the balance restoring aspect. The ancient Greek symbolized this aspect of karma with the deity Nemesis, the ruthless goddess of the justified vengeance, who punishes people who had violated ethics. But that's all mythology, because karma neither punishes nor rewards. It's the human being himself that punishes or rewards. Karma can only work because of the unity of life. If there were no unity, there was no means to get the consequences at your actions. See, the entire process of karma is throwing a stone into a lake. All water particles start to move from where the stone hit the water, which affects all the water molecules of the lake, and the influence lasts as long as the force behind it is working. All nature you can see as an ocean of life, where everything is connected to each other, where everything works together. Imagine that you think that you are separate from the whole, which results in selfish thoughts and action, which means that you are working against nature. Then nature strikes back, and you get the consequences of your thoughts and actions, which you experience as suffering. Let me give you an example. You live for your pleasure, you eat a lot unhealthy food, you drink a lot of alcohol, and then of course you shouldn't be surprised that you become ill. The jar returns the well until it breaks. And don't we see the same in the world? Don't we treat the earth selfishly? And don't we therefore make the earth sick? And don't you think that there won't come a reaction? And will that reaction bring us happiness or sorrow? Look at the absurd form of nationalism. Countries close their borders with physical and mental walls. In Europe, we make deals with dictators so that they constructed refugee camps as far as possible from our own border, so that there is the least chance that those refugees will come to us. What do you think? Is this selfish or unselfish? Imagine what kind of reaction will come. Will that bring us happiness or suffering? Karma means cause and effect. We will be confronted with the consequences of our actions, maybe in this life or maybe in a next life. If we cooperate with nature, a completely different situation arises. Help nature and work on with her, according to H.P. Blavatsky in that little beautiful book, The Voice of the Silence. Help nature, and nature will regard thee as one of their creators and make obeisance. Well, the only way to achieve happiness is melting together with Mother Nature, letting your own nature merge into the big nature. Yeah, letting your own lower self merge into the higher self, letting your personality become super personal. And this can only be done by fully attuning your individual behavior to the unity that underlies everything. And in normal language, this is called, you have to lead a virtuous life, in which you do not live so much for your own interests, but for the welfare of everyone. And of course, we also must know nature. We have to study constantly and I don't mean book wisdom, but would rather think about and meditate on the laws of nature. Those laws of nature, the habit patterns, are universally applicable. Cyclicity is such a pattern. It is the well-known rhythm of sleeping and waking, ebb and flow, life and death. Karma, we just talked about it, is another law. The interconnectedness of all lives, the progressive growth of all consciousness are other patterns, and we must learn to recognize them and then have to learn how to apply them in our own lives. We will present those universal habit patterns during this lecture season here in the Blavatskyhouse, and we never present them as dogmas, but as hypotheses. You will have to think about them independently and actively see if you can discover the truth of them or not. You see, the road to happiness is hard work, and Theosophy combines those laws into 7 major principles or patterns which everyone is able to recognize. You rather study them, as mentioned, as hypotheses, trying to recognize them in everything around you and especially in your own life. We call these laws the 7 jewels of wisdom. And if you continue to follow our talks here in the Blavatskyhouse, you hear much more about them. You must then form an image of those laws, a philosophy of life, which has not been built up by dogmas that you have to believe, but you have obtained that philosophy thanks to your own efforts. The philosophy of life provides satisfying answers to the essential questions of life, such as, what is the meaning of life? And the most important of those habit patterns, the most important of those laws, you can call it the law of laws, is unity. And now we are approaching the core of happiness. This is the real secret. Well, the foundation of everything, of all life expressions, is boundless space, extending in all directions and in all eternities. A boundless ocean of being, or rather, beingness. Every being, how far or how undeveloped it may be, from every atom, yes, even a particle of an atom, to the most vast Milky Way or a cluster of galaxies, everything is an inseparable part of this inconceivable space, this boundless beingness. It's incomprehensible. It's impossible to grasp, even for the wisest human being. And in that boundlessness, a circle arises, a point, the beginning of a cosmos, a universe. It is this one in all. That is the foundation, that is the fountain source of every living being in that universe. Gods, deities, humans, animals, minerals, they are all the rays, the emanations of that one in all, the top of the hierarchy. That top is not a creative God, not at all, not the God of the churches. It cannot create because it already possesses in itself all things, all entities that belong to the universe, that flows from him, or rather, that flows from it. We are the emanations of that top of the deity, the logos, the word, as the Gnostics call it. And maybe you remember, if you had a Christian education, the first verses of the Gospel of St. John, in the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was the Logos, and all things come from that Word, yeah? We therefore carry in ourselves all the possibilities and all the qualities of that logos, of that word, of that top. We are therefore also related to all other living beings because they also emanated from that deity. Compare it with the rays of a sun. Every being is a ray of the logos and is therefore in the core that logos itself. From that top grows, like a tree from a root, the whole tree of the universe, the hierarchy of life, in which every living being is a branch from which other branches, other living beings originate. And the ancients imagined this hierarchy as a tree with its roots in the sky, in the heaven. From the invisible root, the source, the one in all, the trunk flows, and from that trunk, the broad branches, the gods, the archangels, or whatever you want to call them, and then the humans, and the animals, and the plants, and the minerals, etc., etc. All composes that tree, is that tree. And this is how that great hierarchy of life manifests, in which every living being in itself is also a hierarchy, consisting of a spiritual defined part and a vehicle part or a material part. So there are hierarchies within hierarchies, and they all work together. Together, they form the outgrowth, the emanations of the One, the exalted deity, the divine, the top of the universal hierarchy. Now, every top sacrifices itself in a certain respect for everything that flows out of that top. Every top waits and waits, gives up its own progress, so that the other beings that flow from him are able to reach its level. It's the great inspiration, it's the example, it's the goal. It's the goal of the pilgrim's endeavor. It's the blissful point in which all consciousnesses will be dissolved, ultimately. It's the secret of happiness. And how grand is this image? Isn't it more exalted and far more beautiful than the idea that a God created us and that our destiny depends on the will of God, and that our happiness or misfortune comes from his reward or his punishment? And isn't it far and far more beautiful, this image of a living cosmos from which all beings come forth and they are actually the same as the source from which they emanate? Is it far more beautiful than the idea that a human being is nothing more than a bundle of atoms, a vehicle, a body, and nothing more? When we understand something about this hierarchy of life, then we will see in a fellow human being, a fellow pilgrim, a basically divine being who, just like ourselves, falling and standing up again, is trying to walk his path to happiness. We even may perceive this endeavor in animals. This is one of the great universal laws which we call progressive evolution, which means that every being in the period that it is manifested, based on his own karma and returning cyclically, develops more and more consciousness, always realizing greater awareness of the unity of life, until he reaches the limits of his realm, and so until we human beings reach the limit of the human kingdom has to offer, and we have become divine human beings. What a lofty future. Every religion Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, you name it, appeal humans to return to the deity from which they have flowed. Return to Allah you can read in many surahs, in many chapters of the Quran. And Hinduism and Buddhism teach that we finally dissolved in the one which Buddhists call nirvana. We are freed from our lower elements and realize unity, and the Hindus speak of moksha, liberation, the same idea. Only then, when we are freed from all those lower elements, we realize the unity and we are no longer hindered and distracted by the lower aspects of our consciousness. Only then lasting happiness exists, unhindered by the personal, ego-focused aspects of our consciousness. Now you may wonder why we had to leave that state of unity, why we had to descend into the hierarchy of life. Couldn't we have stayed better there? Then we would not have had to deal with all the misery and all the suffering, all the struggle and trial in life. But we must point you at the idea of the law of progressive evolution, on the obligatory pilgrimage, as it is called. That obligatory pilgrimage doesn't mean to say that there is a God or another force outside a human being who says, you must go on pilgrimage. No, it's not that. It means that on the basis of previous lives, previous cycles, on the basis of your own karma, there are some karmic seeds sown who manifest in consequences. It's like when you do certain things today, you will reap the consequences tomorrow, with which you have to cope anyway. That pilgrimage involves, first of all, that you need to develop certain tools again, vehicles, bodies, in which you can manifest and with which you can gain experience again. Compare it with a person who is born again. We assume reincarnation, so a human being has already lived, has already reached a certain level of development, but he must, when he take again a body, so when he is born, he must start as a baby, he must learn to walk, to talk, to read, to write, and so on, until he has reached the level where he was in his previous life. This is the beginning, this is the beings who originate from the one must develop certain vehicles again. They have to descend into this material, in this physical world. In other words, there's first the material evolution, the different bodies, the vehicle side of nature must be developed again, otherwise the spiritual side cannot develop itself. And that spiritual side needs a vehicle, an instrument, in order to gain experience. And if we apply this to the different aspects of our consciousness, then you can say that Atman and Buddhi, in fact, all the triangle, the spiritual side of our nature, first of all, wrapped into the matter, so to speak, build up the vehicle side, develop those lower aspects, so that they can express themselves in those lower aspects and gaining experience, so that the spiritual man can grow and grow in consciousness. And when we learn long enough and have made all those spiritual aspects fully active, with which we control the lower aspects, then we have identified ourselves so with Atman, with the unitary principle within us, that we will be taken up again in the one, in the unity, back to where we came from, but now enriched with the experience that we have gained during that pilgrimage in the material world for so many lives. And what should we learn on that pilgrimage? In other words, what is the road to happiness? Well, we have to understand the true nature of life, the illusions of the outer world, and the reality of the spiritual world. It's that simple. That is the key. And H.P. Blavatsky summarizes this in the small book, but a very beautiful and very wise book, The Voice of the Silence. She says, to live, to benefit mankind is the first step. To practice the 6 glorious virtues, the paramitas, is the second. So you have to practice the ethics, the virtues, but before you do that, so the motive why you do that is that you do it in order to be able to help mankind. And isn't that a great paradox? You can only walk the path to happiness if you do not want to walk it for yourself, but if you want to do it for the sake of others. True happiness is therefore giving others the means, or rather showing them the way to happiness. This summer we were in Berlin. There was a Theosophical Congress, and I saw a poster in Berlin on which was written, and I give the English translation, happiness is the only thing that you can pass on, even if you don't possess it. And that is similar to a statement of Aristotle, who says, happiness is the only thing that doubles if it is shared. And in both statements there is a lot of wisdom, I think. In fact, they indicate that individual happiness cannot exist. And that makes sense, I think, if you assume unity. If unity is a reality, then isolation or separation from unity is an illusion and can therefore never lead to lasting happiness. So, before you want to practice the paramitas, the virtues, you must have as motive that you do it for the sake of humanity, to be a blessing to mankind. You know, in fact, it's all imaginary because we simply do not have the words to express this exalted state of oneness. And when we speak of the fact that we return to the unity, then it's only a way of speaking, because in reality we never have left that unity. The fact is that we are not aware of it. So we have to realize who we really are. However, if you think carefully about the quote of H.P. Blavatsky in The Voice of the Silence, the first step is to live to benefit mankind, then you perceive that the deeper happiness, the real bliss, is not so much a pursuit of a divine unity. For how spiritual and exalted this may be, how many selfless acts you may do for this, if the endeavor is focused on that salvation, focused on nirvana, because union with the divine, with the one, with the unity you may call nirvana, then there is still a selfish motive that drives us. And every form of selfishness is ignorance with regard to the unity of life. And because if you fully realize the unity, perceiving it with your spiritual eyes, then there can never be a form of selfishness, not even spiritual selfishness, nor can there be a desire for the peace and bliss of nirvana. When we just said that at the moment that the universe manifests itself, the moment it was born, and we all came from the root of that universal tree, we mean to say that unity is the highest law. So when you live according to that one law, you meet the highest qualities of that law. And we told that the top of the hierarchy sacrifices itself in order that all beings who derive from it can benefit from its inspiration and eventually will be united with it. If you live according to that one universal, all-encompassing law, and you follow the example of the sacrifice of the top of that hierarchy, then you live a compassionate life. And that's why Helena Blavatsky says that compassion is the law of laws. And you know, from a personal perspective, it seems that you abandon your happiness if you refuse your own salvation because you know that you are needed somewhere. Imagine that you want to go on vacation, but your neighbor is ill and there is no one to take care of him. You sacrifice your holiday. Well, is that suffering? Is that sadness? Or does the fact that you exercise your compassionate duty ultimately gives far more spiritual peace and satisfaction than those 3 weeks on the beach? Just think about it. If you see the unity of life, you never really come across these kinds of issues again because you are always compassionate in life. And compassion is then the greatest happiness, the greatest bliss. You know, we are looking for a road to happiness, but there is no road to happiness. Happiness is the road. So if you conceive happiness as the joy of working for others, if you know that happiness is the exercise of virtue, then you have solved the secret of happiness. We would like to end with a quote from H.P. Blavatsky. It's a small text that was found on her desk after she died, and this quote perfectly indicates what we wanted to say to you this afternoon. It reads as follows. There is a road steep and thorny, beset with perils of every kind, but yet a road, and it leads to the very heart of the universe. So it leads to the state of bliss, of happiness, lasting happiness. I can tell you how to find those who will show you the secret gateway that opens inward only and closes fast behind the nail fate forevermore. There is no danger that dauntless courage cannot conquer. There is no trial that spotless purity cannot pass through. There is no difficulty that strong intellect cannot surmount. For those who win onward, there is a reward past all telling. And now we may think, now comes the description of the reward, the description of nirvana, a description of unity, of a blissful state. What is the reward? And H.P. Blavatsky continues, for those who win onward, there is a reward past all telling. The power to bless and save humanity. For those who fail, there are other lives in which success may come. Okay, what did we say? We talked about karma, cause and effect, the law of restoring balance. Going against nature leads to suffering. All beings originate from and are rooted in the One, the Logos, or however you want to call it. The top of the hierarchy sacrifices itself for the benefit of all living beings in the hierarchy. Progressive evolution, continual development of beings. Firstly, a descent into the matter, the material world, takes place, and then a return to the spirit, enriched with the experience gained in the material world. and the realization of oneness, compassion, is the greatest bliss. Any questions? Yes, please.
You started your talk with saying that people mostly look for happiness outside themselves, in things in the outer world. Is there a connection with this view with the thought of the struggle for life? Because the struggle for life is you have to get things you need, well, somewhere in the world.
Yeah, I think there's a connection, and if the struggle of life is the only philosophy you have in your life, then you think that selfishness is something good, because it's the only way to survive, and that's why we say, well, the struggle of life doesn't mean that you have to struggle just for yourself, because modern scientific discoveries, and we have one of our members who knows a lot about it, have showed that in fact in the community is the survival far more realistic than as an individual. In other words, working together is far better to survive than to do it as an individual. So the struggle of life, in the meaning that you have to go for your own interest, is not something that, according to the Theosophical teaching, is true. We have to do it as a community. And I think that this is one of, Darwin is often quoted wrongly, because I don't know exactly what he meant, but a lot of, supporters of Darwin, after he died, they stole his ideas and, make it much more fanatic than Darwin really was. And in fact, the term struggle of life nowadays is used to as an argument for selfishness. Yeah, it's a sad thing. Yeah. But there are some changes in the biological world. Yes, please.
You also said in the first part that not all desire is bad, or leads to suffering, better said. Can you comment on that a little more in relation to the second line on the screen, going against nature leads to suffering? Like,
yes.
If your desire is in line with nature, then...
You may say that personal or selfish desires, is going against nature. But the desire to help your fellow man or desire to obtain knowledge or wisdom are, altruistic desires, because with the knowledge you want to gain, if you want to use it in order to help your fellow man, is a good desire. So desire is the middle of the 7 aspects of our consciousness, and you can use it as a mean to go up, and you can use it to identify yourself with the material world, and then it leads to the suffering, because you go against the laws of nature. Yeah? So it's not bad, it's not good, per se. It depends on the motive and on the way you use it. In fact, this is the same with all the 7 aspects. None of them is bad, none of them is good per se, but it depends the way you use them. Yeah?
So can you say that the desire is not attached to the outcome, then, or much rather, it's rather linked to the motive than to the outcome?
Yeah, the color of the desire, is linked to the motive. Yeah, so if you have a great desire to help your country or to help your fellow man, well, it's another color than a great desire to buy a big car or to, yeah. And unfortunately, I think most of the desires we have nowadays are desires focused on the material world and therefore often selfish. But you need, the desire also to develop your intellectual part and your spiritual part, your idealistic part, etc. So we cannot do without desire, but we have to use it in a proper way, and a proper way is an unselfish way, according to Theosophy. Yeah? Yes, please?
In this perspective, would you still call it desire? Is it not more being oneself, living from the highest you can imagine? Would you call this still desire?
I think that without desire, without will, the will to do something, desire to do something, never will happen. Nothing will happen in the world. The start of the universe was because of desire. The baby who is born because of the desire. In Sanskrit they call it tanya, thirst, trishna. The thirst, the desire to go back to the world. So without desire, you won't even get born, or the universe will not be there. So desire is needed. And desire is not bad, but you have to use it on a good, proper, unselfish way. Yeah? If I got not any desire, I wouldn't stand here and wouldn't give a presentation about Theosophy. Maybe that was better for you, but yeah, there is some kind of desire in me to stand here, and hopefully it's an unselfish desire. Yeah? Other questions? You've all grasped the idea of happiness, so you are all happy now? Are you happy? All right. No questions? Then we end with the kite tree of the Rig Veda, what is it? And the unity in this kite tree is, the symbol of that unity is a sun, a golden sun. And so it's something within you, not outside of you. It's the unity that is in fact the same as in me, as in you, as in an ant, in an animal, in a star. Yeah? So, O thou, golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.